The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. Part 7 of the Systems of Moral Philosophy. Section 2 of the different accounts which have been given of the nature of virtue. Chapter 2 of those systems which make virtue consist in prudence. The most ancient of those systems which make virtue consist in prudence, and have which any considerable remains have come down to us, is that of Epicurus, who is said, however, to have borrowed all the leading principles of his philosophy from some of those who had gone before him, particularly from Aristippus, though it is very probable, notwithstanding this allegation of his enemies, that at least his manner of applying those principles was altogether his own. According to Epicurus, bodily pleasures and pain were the sole ultimate objects of natural desire and aversion. That they were always the natural object of those passions he thought required no proof. Pleasure might, indeed, appear sometimes to be avoided, not however because it was pleasure, but because by the enjoyment of it we should either forfeit some greater pleasure, or to expose ourselves to some pain that was more to be avoided than this pleasure was to be desired. Pain in the same manner might appear sometimes to be eligible, not however because it was pain, but because by enduring it we might either avoid a still greater pain, or acquire some pleasure of much more importance. That bodily pain and pleasure, therefore, were always the natural objects of desire and aversion, was, he thought, abundantly evident. Nor was it less so, he imagined, that they were the sole ultimate objects of those passions. Whatever else was desired or avoided was so, according to him, upon account of its tendency to produce one or other of those sensations. The tendency to procure pleasure rendered power and riches desirable, as the contrary tendency to produce pain made poverty and insignificancy the objects of aversion. Honor and reputation were valued, because the esteem and love of those we live with were of the greatest consequence both to procure pleasure and to defend us from pain. Ignominy and bad fame, on the contrary, were to be avoided, because the hatred, contempt, and resentment of those we lived with destroyed all security and necessarily exposed us to the greatest bodily evils. All the pleasures and pains of the mind were, according to Epicurus, ultimately derived from those of the body. The mind was happy when it thought of the past pleasures of the body and hoped for others to come, and it was miserable when it thought of the pains which the body had formerly endured and dreaded the same or greater thereafter. But the pleasures and pains of the mind, though ultimately derived from those of the body, were vastly greater than their originals. The body felt only the sensation of the present instant, whereas the mind felt also the past and the future, the one by remembrance, the other by anticipation, and consequently both suffered and enjoyed much more. When we are under the greatest bodily pain, he observed, we shall always find, if we attend to it, that it is not the suffering of the present instant which chiefly torments us, but either the agonizing remembrance of the past, or the yet more horrible dread of the future. The pain of each instant, considered by itself, and cut off from all that goes before and all that comes after it, is a trifle, not worth the regarding, yet this is all which the body can ever be said to suffer. In the same manner, when we enjoy the greatest pleasure, we shall always find that the bodily sensation, the sensation of the present instant, makes but a small part of our happiness, that our enjoyment chiefly arises either from the cheerful recollection of the past or the still more joyous anticipation of the future, and that the mind always contributes by the largest share of the entertainment. Since our happiness and misery, therefore, depended chiefly on the mind, if this part of our nature was well disposed, if our thoughts and opinions were as they should be, it was of little importance in what manner our body was affected. Though under great bodily pain, we might still enjoy a considerable share of happiness. If our reason and judgment maintained their superiority, we might entertain ourselves with the remembrance of the past, and with the hopes of future pleasure. We might soften the rigor of our pains, by recollecting what it was which even in this situation we were under any necessity of suffering. That this was merely the bodily sensation, the pain of the present instant, which by itself could never be very great. That whatever agony we suffered from the dread of its continuance was the effect of an opinion of the mind, which might be corrected by juster sentiments, by considering that, if our pains were violent, they would probably be of short duration, and that if they were long continuance, they would probably be moderate, and admit of many intervals of ease, and that at any rate death was always at hand and within call to deliver us, which as, according to him, it put an end to all sensation either of pain or pleasure, could not be regarded as an evil. When we are, said he, death is not, and when death is, we are not. Death, therefore, can be nothing to us. If the actual sensation of positive pain was in itself so little to be feared, that of pleasure was still less to be desired, naturally the sensation of pleasure was much less pungent than that of pain. If, therefore, this last could take so very little from the happiness of the well-disposed mind, the other could add scarce anything to it. When the body was free from pain, and the mind from fear and anxiety, the superrated sensation of bodily pleasure could be of very little importance, and though it might diversify, could not properly be said to increase the happiness of the situation. In ease of body, therefore, and in security or tranquillity of mind, consisted, according to Epicurus, the most perfect state of human nature, the most complete happiness to which man was capable of enjoying. To obtain this great end of natural desire was the sole object of all the virtues, which, according to him, were not desirous upon their own account, but upon account of their tendency to bring about the situation. Prudence, for example, though according to this philosophy the source and principle of all the virtues, was not desirable upon its own account. That careful and laborious and circumspect state of mind, ever watchful and ever attentive to the most distant consequences of every action, could not be a thing pleasant or agreeable for its own sake, but upon account of its tendency to procure the greatest goods and to keep off the greatest evils. To abstain from pleasure too, to curb and restrain our natural passions for enjoyment, which was the office of temperance, could never be desirable for its own sake. The whole value of this virtue arose from its utility, from its enabling us to postpone the present enjoyment for the sake of a greater to come, or to avoid a greater pain that might ensue from it. Temperance, in short, was nothing but prudence with regard to pleasure. To support labor, to endure pain, to be exposed to danger or to death, the situations which fortitude would often lead us into, were surely still less the objects of natural desire. They were chosen only to avoid greater evils. We submitted to labor in order to avoid the greater shame and pain of poverty, and we exposed ourselves to danger and to death in defense of our liberty and property, the means and instruments of pleasure and happiness, or in defense of our country, and the safety of which, our own, was necessarily comprehended. Fortitude enabled us to do all this cheerfully, as the best which, in our present situation, could possibly be done, and was in reality no more than prudence, good judgment, and presence of mind, in properly appreciating pain, labor, and danger, always choosing the less in order to avoid the greater. It is the same case with justice. To abstain from what is another's was not desirable on its own account, and it could not surely be better for you that I should possess what is my own, than that you should possess it. You ought, however, to abstain from whatever belongs to me, because by doing otherwise you will provoke the resentment and indignation of mankind. The security and tranquillity of your mind will be entirely destroyed. You will be filled with fear and consternation at the thought of that punishment which you will imagine that men are at all times ready to inflict upon you, and from which no power, no art, no concealment, will ever, in your own fancy, be sufficient to protect you. That other species of justice which consists in doing proper good offices to different persons, according to the various relations of neighbors, kinsmen, friends, benefactors, superiors, or equals, which they may stand in to us, is recommended by the same reason. To act properly in all these different relations procures us to the esteem and love of those we live with, and to do otherwise excites their contempt and hatred. By the one we naturally secure, by the other we necessarily endanger our own ease and tranquillity. The great and ultimate objects of our desires, the whole virtue of justice, therefore, the most important of all the virtues, is no more than discreet and prudent conduct with regard to our neighbors. Such is the doctrine of Epicurus concerning the nature of virtue. It may seem extraordinary that this philosopher, who is described as a person of the most amiable manners, should never have observed that whatever may be the tendency of those virtues, or of the contrary vices, with regard to our bodily ease and security, the sentiments which they naturally excite in other passions are objects of a much more passionate desire or aversion than all their other consequences; that to be amiable, to be respectable, to be the proper object of esteem, is by every well-disposed mind more valued than all the ease and security which love, respect, and esteem can procure us; that on the contrary to be odious, to be contemptible, to be the proper object of that indignation, is more dreadful than all that we can suffer in our body from hatred, contempt, or indignation; and that consequently our desire of the one character and our aversion to the other cannot arise from any regard to the effects which either of them is likely to produce upon this body. This system is, no doubt, altogether inconsistent with that which I have been endeavoring to establish. It is not difficult, however, to discover from what phasis, if I may say so, from what particular view or aspect of nature, this account of things derives its probability. By the wise contrivance of the Author of nature, virtue is upon all ordinary occasions, even with regard to this life, real wisdom, and the surest and readiest means of obtaining both safety and advantage. Our success or disappointment in our undertakings must very much depend upon a good or bad opinion which is commonly entertained of us, and upon the general disposition of those we live with, either to assist or to oppose us. But the best, the surest, the easiest, and the readiest way of obtaining the advantageous and avoiding the unfavorable judgments of others, is undoubtedly to render ourselves the proper objects of the former and not the latter. Do you desire, says Socrates, the reputation of a good musician? The only way of obtaining it is to become a good musician. Would you desire in the same manner to be thought capable of serving your country either as a general or as a statesman? The best way in this case, too, is really to acquire the art and experience of war and government, and to become really fit to be a general or a statesman. And in the same manner, if you would be reckoned sober, temperate, just, and equitable, the best way of acquiring this reputation is to become sober, temperate, just, and equitable. If you can really render yourself amiable, respectable, and the proper object of esteem, there is no fear of your not soon acquiring the love, the respect, and the esteem of those you live with. Since the practice of virtue, therefore, is in general so advantageous, and that of vice so contrary to our interest, the consideration of those opposite tendencies undoubtedly stamps an additional beauty and propriety upon the one, and a new deformity and impropriety upon the other. Temperance, magnanimity, justice, and beneficence come thus to be approved of, not only under their proper characters, but under the additional character of the highest wisdom, and most real prudence; and in the same manner the contrary vices of intemperance, pusillanimity, injustice, and either malevolence or sordid selfishness come to be disapproved of, not only under their proper characters, but under the additional characters of the most short-sighted folly and weakness. Epicurus appears in every virtue to have attended to this species of propriety only. It is that which is most apt to occur to those who are endeavoring to persuade others to regularity of conduct. When men by their practice, and perhaps too by their maxims, manifestly show that the natural beauty of virtue is not like to have much effect upon them, how is it possible to move them but by representing the folly of their conduct, and how much they themselves are in the end likely to suffer by it? By running up all the different virtues too, to this one species of propriety, Epicurus indulged in propensity which is natural to all men, but which philosophers in particular are apt to cultivate with a peculiar fondness, as the great means of displaying their ingenuity, the propensity to account for all appearances from as few principles as possible; and he, no doubt, indulged this propensity still further, when he referred all the primary objects of natural desire and aversion to the pleasures and pains of the body. The great patron of the atymotical philosophy, who took so much pleasure in deducing all the powers and qualities of bodies from the most obvious and familiar figure, motion, and arrangement of the small parts of matter, felt no doubt a similar satisfaction when he accounted, in the same manner, for all the sentiments and passions of the mind from those which are most obvious and familiar. The system of Epicurus agreed with those of Plato, Aristotle, and Zeno, in making virtue consist in acting in the most suitable manner to obtain the primary objects of the natural desire. It differed from all of them in two other respects. First, in the account which it gave of those primary objects of the natural desire, and secondly, in the account which it gave of the excellence of virtue, or of the reason why that quality ought to be esteemed. The primary objects of natural desire consisted according to Epicurus in bodily pleasure and pain, and in nothing else; whereas according to the other three philosophers, there were many other objects, such as knowledge, such as the happiness of our relations, of our friends, of our country, which were ultimately desirable for their own sakes. Virtue, too, according to Epicurus, did not deserve to be pursued for its own sake, nor was it itself one of the ultimate objects of natural appetite, but was eligible only upon account of its tendency to prevent pain and procure ease and pleasure. In the opinion of the other three, on the contrary, it was desirable, not merely as the objects of procuring the other primary objects of natural desire, but as something which was in itself more valuable than them all. Man, they thought, being born for action, his happiness must consist, not merely in the agreeableness of his passive sensations, but also in the propriety of his active exertions.